Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host Weeb Union, and in this one we have major developments in the entirety of the Donetsk region, from the very northernmost area to the southernmost area, and the Russians have just started a general offensive across the entirety of the front. We see the Russians have advanced several kilometers in multiple parts of the front line, and hardly any single part is unmoved. We see and start out in the direction of Seremeyorsk, where the Russians have managed to capture the Ukrainian fortified position north of Seremeyorsk, along the front line according to the first lines, and have completely secured the town. So with this, the Russians have managed to completely secure Seremeyorsk, and that is due to this geolocated footage here, showing the Russian advance according to a latest Russian Ministry of Defense video of the area. We also have this area here east of Volodar, where the Russians have managed to capture about 3.5 to 4 square kilometers of territory, advancing along the entirety of the front, capturing multiple forest lines, and moving on to the next fortified positions of the Ukrainians here east of Volodar. So that is the area here in the south. We also see the Russians capturing parts in Krasnohorivka, advancing on the eastern and western part of the residential area, gaining control over the rest of the apartment complex buildings, and moving northwards along the western parts of Krasnohorivka. So they've managed to capture the final defenses of the Ukrainians here to the west. Further north in the direction of Karelivka and Yasnopodivka, the Russians have advanced here as well, capturing the rest of the village area, as well as advancing within Karelivka, where we see this footage here of a Russian soldier throwing a bag of explosives into the building, after which it completely blows up. So this is how they are moving from building to building in such a heavily contested area. Further north in the direction of the north of Novoselivka Persia, the Russians have stormed south of Sokol, capturing 3 forest lines, and the 4th one up directly by the Ukrainian fortified positions north of Novoselivka Persia, where the fighting is taking place now. At the same time, the Russians have also captured multiple fortified positions of the Ukrainians north of Yevhenivka, in the direction of Prodes, south of Alexandrivka. So the Russians have managed to advance in 2 significant parts, capturing multiple fortified positions and fighting over several others. So the Russians are attempting to break through the Ukrainian lines and have managed to pass over the second line of defense of the Ukrainians in the area, leaving no further lines that is coherent ahead of their positions in the north. So we see that significant developments are taking place here as well. At the same time, the Russians have managed to reach the fortified positions east of Vostyushenka, so the Russians are also advancing further by Novoalexandrivka. They're likely going to capture the final parts as well before attacking Vostyushenka as well. And we see that the Russians are advancing generally across the entirety of the Avdiivka section of the front line. In the direction of New York, we see a 3-kilometer long breakthrough yet again, where Russians have managed to capture Yurivka and significant portions of residential area south of New York, reaching the outskirts of the town itself. So this is a significant straight line, beeline breakthrough. According to some reports, it is another pipeline that they found. However, I've seen no confirmation of such reports yet, so we'll have to wait until further confirmation arrives. But this was reported by Deep State Map, a significant breakthrough by the Russian forces. At the same time, here in the direction of Chasiv Yar, Deep State Map also reports a complete capture of the canal micro-district and everything east of the canal really by the Russians here along the railway line and to the south. So we see that the Russians have made a breakthrough here as well. We also see this video here of Russian soldiers waving the Russian flag within one of the buildings at the western outskirts of the canal micro-district. So the Russians have managed to capture the canal micro-district of Chasiv Yar after months of fighting, really. Further north in the direction of Makiivka, the Russians have managed to enter the town from the east, and at the same time they've captured the northern outskirts, the small residential area here north of the town. So the Russians have managed to advance both to the north and to the east of it. Therefore, we see the Russian developments all across the Donetsk front, from the very northern parts to the very southern parts. Going back into the different developments we see here in the direction of Volodar, With the recent Russian advance, they have managed to move on to the next forest lines and are closing in on the road between Volodar and Konstantinivka. This development allows the Russians to slowly advance across the front line. We saw through the month of June, the Russians were advancing across the entirety area between Pobieda and down south to Volodar, and we're going to see that continuing until the Russians have aligned according to the road, cut off the road here by Vodiane, and then start attacking Volodar and Konstantinivka from the south and from the north. So we see developments in the direction of Konstantinivka and Volodar, as those are the main targets of the Russians in this area. In the direction of Krasnodarivka, the Russians have now secured the apartment complex area in the western part of the city, which gives a significant advantage to the Russians in the area. They have now gained control over the apartment complexes. This means that they can continue advancing until the northern parts of Krasnodarivka with hardly any resistance, as the normal residential buildings do not really offer that much resistance. So with this, we see the western part of Krasnodarivka can be considered fallen, but the eastern part, still some apartment complex buildings remain. But if the Russians are able to connect the eastern parts from the north to the western part, then they'll be able to significantly damage the Ukrainian positions in the area, hurt their capabilities to defend, or even flanking their eastern positions from the west through the central area here in Krasnodarivka or through the northern parts, would completely cut off the supplies going into the eastern part, and the entire eastern part could be encircled. So this is a significant development in favor of the Russians. Further north in the direction of Yasnobrodivka and Karelivka, with the complete control over Yasnobrodivka, it is only a matter of time before the Russians align the forest line and the front line to the Karelovske Reservoir and the Vovcha River line. In the northern direction of Novoselivka Persia, this advance allows Russians to directly attack the Ukrainian fortified positions in the area. Them already aligned front line to the east and to the south means that it is only a matter of time until Novoselivka Persia is stormed from three separate directions, from the north, east, and from the south. And this is a significant development, as Novoselivka Persia is the final position of the Ukrainians ahead of this next line of defense along the Vovcha River line. And to the north, the Russians have already broken through the defensive lines. This means with the capture of Novoselivka Persia, the Russians will redirect their forces to the north in the direction of Pokrovsk and the highway between Pokrovsk and Konstantinivka. And we see that with the Russian advance by Novoalexandrivka, that they never stop in this direction either. So the Russians simply are advancing across the entire Avdiivka front line. In the New York direction, the front line moved this far, allowing the Russians to now reach the outskirts of New York. This, combined with the advances here to the east of Donetsk, indicate that the Ukrainian lines in New York and Donetsk are in a very difficult position. The Ukrainians will now be forced to quickly and in an emergency situation redirect their forces here in the direction of New York and Donetsk. Otherwise, we may see the fall of both of these cities very quickly in comparison to how heavily defended they are. There is a complete and clear indication that these defensive lines in New York and Donetsk could collapse if no emergency reinforcements are sent to these areas due to the recent and significant Russian developments in the area. In the Chasiv Yar direction, with the complete capture of the apartment complex area here in the Chasiv Yar micro-district and the final parts of it, the Russians have now aligned the front line with the canal from Ivanivsk to the south to Kalinia in the north. The Russians will look to capture the final parts of Kalinia and gain a foothold across both in the forest patch but also in the micro area here north of Chasiv Yar. At the same time, we see these developments in the direction of Rihorivka and Orihova-Vasilivka, indicating that the Russians may also be looking to expand further northwards. So we see that the situation in Chasiv Yar may also rapidly develop over the next few days as the Russians initiate the next phase of the offensive operation. In the direction of Makivka, this indicates that the Russians are moving further in the direction of the Serbets River line from a northwest direction and down south. If they move along the Serbets River line, then they can move down and continue the operations from the south and from the north, combining these two into a pincer maneuver in the eastern bank of the Serbets River. So we see that the Russians have managed to advance all across the entirety of the Donetsk front, And at the same time, according to the latest reports, the Russians have also been able to recapture the parts of Luboka, which the Ukrainians managed to capture, and have aligned the front line down south of Luboka as well. This means that the Ukrainian counterattack in the area has failed. At the same time, the Russians have been launching massive artillery strikes here in the Luboka direction, indicating that they may switch to offensive operations again following this Ukrainian counteroffensive failure. And that is all for this update. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, and check out my Patreon for additional content. Thank you for watching and have a great day.